In talking about places, we want to move now from Baltimore to the world. Our next guest, Alexis Bonnell, is Innovation Evangelist. Is that a cool title or what? Innovation Evangelist at all places at the U.S. Global Development Lab. She's developed and delivered over $1 billion, yes, that was a B, $1 billion of humanitarian and development aid in more than 25 nations, places going through war, coming out of war, and places that are really developing as a country and as government. Spent more than 20 years in management in all facets of development work, has gone to some great universities. She's going to talk here about some of her work throughout the world. Alexis.
Thanks so much, Tom. Good morning, or good afternoon. So first of all, I have to say to the organizers, the food was amazing. So I don't know if you guys are suffering from kind of the food coma. And for those of you that are watching, I hope you have something good in your bellies. So I am with the government. Never fear, we're here, right? I'm sure that strikes incredible, confidence in you all. But really, it should. And part of that is because we're doing some absolutely amazing things with you, and you just might not know about it. So I work in the U.S. Global Development Lab, and in essence, what happened with USAID, and if you don't know who we are, we're the U.S. Agency for International Development. So we have a $20 or so billion budget, and we really work to kind of help the world conquer humanity's greatest challenges. And we woke up a couple years ago and said, it's really interesting. We do all this work in education and health and in Africa, and yet if you look at all of the other industries, what's really modernized them has been kind of the connective tissue elements, right? Has been data, has been mobile phones, has been these types of things, and that's no one's job here. And so the U.S. Global Development Lab was kind of born out of the idea that we really needed to harness science, technology, innovation, and partnership. And in essence, we have a two-part mission. The first is to actually find and identify breakthrough innovations that are, in fact, game-changing. The second is actually to modernize the development industry, and starting with ourselves. And so by a show of hands, and for those of you who are watching, play with me as well, how many of you have had Gatorade? Yeah? Okay, so a very Gatorade-friendly crowd. Gatorade is based on oral rehydration therapy science. And oral rehydration therapy came out many, many years ago. And we had the scientific evidence that it worked and that, that we should really use it in places where people were suffering from cholera or other types of things where dehydration was really dangerous. And interestingly enough, we knew it worked. We had the evidence. And then it took us 35 years to get it into common practice. 35 years. In the meantime, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if there was a new Harry Potter book, how long would it take that to get into 10 million hands? Overnight, right? And so we live in this great irony in the development industry, or what I like to call the humanity industry, about how we leverage these types of things. And I'm going to spend my time talking to you about two different frames that I'm really passionate about. And one of those is what I like to call demand-driven development. And this is, in my mind, the #1 game changer of our industry. And what I mean by that is that right now, there's a woman in a village with a cell phone. If she had our mission director's number or someone really important in our structure or another donor structure's number, she could text them and say, I don't want this. I want and need that, right? So instead of us telling, oh, we're here to help you. Here's, let us help. Here's what we're going to give you. Here's how we're going to help. Actually letting her determine and say, what is it that I need, right? Because in these places, there's no shortage of ingenuity. Right? There's no shortage of a clear understanding of what they're facing. What there often is a shortage of is partners and resources to kind of help and in the same way get out of the way, right? And let these types of solutions happen. And part of the evidence why we know that works is because we run a lot of different types of contests and challenges. And one of those are called our Grand Challenges for Development. And all of you are eligible for these types of money, funding, et cetera. And what we do is 3 different types of innovation at the lab. The first is operational innovation. So we look at kind of the non-sexy stuff, but how do we procure faster? How do we have more legal flexibility? How do we hire better talent? The second is open innovation. So in other words, any idea from anywhere at any time. And we have a program called Development Innovation Ventures that anyone can apply for that resources that. But the final one is directed innovation. And with directed innovation, we use it to solve particular challenges. And I'm going to share some of those solutions and the people I'm really excited about. But the most interesting thing about that directed innovation is when we looked back and we saw where our solutions were coming from, 50% of what we were funding or more came from an innovator or an entrepreneur in the country that was facing this, right? And so it was a clear nod that people know what it is we need to tackle and how to go about doing it. So one of the things I think is really a question for us in stepping back is that with the proliferation of mobile phones and with data, and one of the things I want to challenge us with when it comes to the idea of data, stop calling it data. Because when you say data to me, it's like data. Right? It's like that person over there's job who does the crunching of the data, right? It's business intelligence, right? And our industry needs business intelligence just like any other industry. We need to be making better decisions, smarter decisions. And the idea of demand-driven development is only going to happen if we're really using business intelligence about what our customer, notice I don't say beneficiary, notice I don't say those things, right? Our customer wants. And so I want to step back for a minute, and I'm going to tell you about a few things that also excite me around the next frame. And the next frame is the idea of democratized development. And what I mean by that is normally when we used to go about the normal way of kind of solving problems or applying resources, let's say we were taking on, as an agency, maternal and child health, and we have a brilliant global health unit that looks at this. The normal way we do things is get kind of the qualified likely suspects in the room and kind of have them come up with an answer, right? So in the case of maternal and child health, we would have doctors, midwives, maybe education specialists, and they would come up with something. What we wouldn't have in the room, let's say if we were tackling breech birth, is one of the winners of our grand challenge, his name is Jorge Odon. And Jorge came up with a breech birth device that helps reposition the baby that's in the wrong position. And that's one of a really dangerous situation for mother and child. And Jorge got the idea, I've been told, by watching a YouTube video on how to get a cork out of a bottle of wine in one piece that had fallen into it. I don't know about you. I know there's a strong correlation between alcohol and birth, but that's not where any of our qualified or smart people would have looked, right? But the second most interesting thing about Jorge is that Jorge was an Argentinian car mechanic. And again, I don't know about you, but I would not have been smart enough to think about Bill, who I just took my Kia into to rotate my tires, about having him in the room about talking about birthing solutions, right? And this is one of the most interesting things about democratized development is that time after time after time, we never get it right. And so one of the things we love is the idea that these ideas, what really works, can come from the most unusual places, right? And probably are coming from you. So Jorge is someone I'm a big fan of. And I'm going to show you a few others. So this is the CellScope. The CellScope was created by students at Berkeley. And again, it's one of those things, sometimes the most important things aren't the big idea, right? One of the most important things we found about innovation, it's about iteration. It's about taking something, testing it, seeing if it works, et cetera. And the CellScope is super cool. In essence, what you'll see right here is they kind of took the early 3D printer and they printed a very small housing. And then they deconstructed a microscope and a light, and they put it together. And in essence, one of the major issues we see overseas, and especially in the more remote areas, is a lack of access to health, and especially diagnostics, right? So imagine if you went into the doctor. Well, there was a doctor for you to go into, or any type of medical professional, and they said, well, we think it's this. It could be this, or it could be this. Not a lot of confidence, right? And if you actually wanted to know the answer, you have to go 300 miles that way, and you have no car and no bike, right? So it starts becoming really daunting. And what they looked at is they said, mobile phone technology is amazing. And so what they did is they stepped back, they deconstructed this very small kind of microscope reader of a slide, and then they programmed an app that could read and diagnose, the most common types of things that they were seeing. So you have instant diagnosis, and if it can't diagnose it, it sends it to someone who can put eyes on it, right? I mean, talk about a game changer. One of the things I want to frame for us is often we think about development as being, a harder place, to innovate. They lack power or other types of things. And I would challenge that. I actually think most of the developing world is easier to apply innovation to because you can leapfrog, right? When you look at, for example, mobile finance, we don't need to build banks. We don't need to teach people how to write checks because they're already able to use mobile technology. And so one of the things we really like to see is how can we foster that type of leapfrogging. The second one I'm going to share with you is the Ebola, what we call PPE, personal protective equipment suit. And if you can imagine, back in September, October, the president called our administrator and said, hey, you really have to get a handle on the personal protective equipment of your healthcare workers. And what was happening is that, in essence, the average healthcare worker was only able to work for about 35 to 45 minutes before their heart rate reached 165. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if my heart rate is at 165, it is not pretty. Right? I'm holding on to the treadmill, sweating, and it's just not pretty stuff. And what was even worse is that, of course, it would take 20 minutes or even more to take off the kit, to get a breather, another 20 minutes to put it on, 2 people, in essence, usually to help. And so this was a really critical issue where we had all of these amazing, dedicated healthcare workers that weren't able to spend time with their patients. Right? And the other thing is, I want you to think about for a minute, if you were lying in that bed, and you were facing Ebola, and you probably had friends, loved ones, et cetera, that hadn't made it. And I want you to think about that coming at you, right? Where the only thing you see are these teeny eyes, right? No other facial expression, no other humanity. And so there's an element of that as well. And so one of the things we did is we actually took on the Ebola Grand Challenge. We said, yes, Mr. President, we're going to get on it. And in 7 days, we had actually opened a legally procurement and other compliant type of challenge. And over that period of time, and again, our global health unit is just heroes, they actually received 1,500 ideas. And this one, interestingly enough, came from a group of Johns Hopkins students, but also an absolutely amazing innovator. And to be perfectly honest, I think when that innovator showed up in the room the first time, people were kind of like, oh, that's cute. You're so cute, you want to help, oh, it's so sweet. Because that innovator was a wedding dress designer, right? And if you think about it, in hindsight, which is always perfect, right, you can say, wow, if I'm trying to recreate, a PPE suit that has less seams, can be taken off by one person, might be lighter, might be more agile, she's got a little bit of experience with that, right? She knows what it takes, a heavy dress, all these types of things. And so again, it makes total sense. And the most interesting thing about the final Ebola suit, and you'll see it, limitation of 28 points of contamination down to 10, a ton of wonderful technical things. The most interesting thing for us is that after being able to use it in the field, et cetera, is that it debuted at New York Fashion Week, right? So I don't know how often in government you could be like, okay, yeah, we just had some stuff on New York Fashion Week, which is kind of cool. So the next one I want to share with you, and this actually also came out of the Ebola Grand Challenge. And again, sometimes this is really common sense, but we're just not always thinking with common sense, right? And one of the issues was, as an Ebola worker, you would often get sprayed down with bleach as another way of just making sure that you were safe and protected. Now, think about it. What color, when you pour bleach into the dishwasher, what color is it? It's clear. How do you know what you actually covered and what you didn't, right? Again, pretty common sense, and yet we sat there kind of bleaching over again, couldn't see it, it was running down. And so, these innovators and entrepreneurs, and I use those words very much interchangeably, in essence came up with a wonderful solution that, as you can see, simply made it colored, right? Made it kind of stick a little bit more for a while. And what we're really proud of is that this actually has just been recently adopted. And again, we do these types of innovations for the developing world, right over there. And yet, ironically, we have seen so many of them come back here. And the New York Fire Department is actually including this now in their protocol in looking at hazmat, which is pretty awesome. And in fact, the ODON device that I mentioned was funded now by a US medical device company. So it's really interesting how with all this intent, for us over there, we weren't even smart enough to figure out that some of these things are universal, right? The final one that I'm going to touch on is kind of desalination. And it was interesting because a lot of the challenges over in the developing world where we work is access to water. And interestingly enough, in India and in many places, there are a lot of water purification devices. And they work. And the water is safe to drink. But guess what? it tastes like crap, right? And most of the time, because it's really salty, right? It's brackish. And so, a lot of people, again, from the customer view, well, great, you've given me safe water, but I don't particularly enjoy drinking it, right? Product problem, right? And so, interestingly enough, we put out this call for a desalination prize. And one of the students from MIT came up not only with an amazing thing that we tested out in New Mexico, the desalination unit, but she actually was able to power it with solar. Right? So instead of having all of the time and energy and cost that it usually takes to desalinate brackish water, she was able to, in essence, make a dual use. And what was really interesting, of course, is if you're familiar with California, which is where I am, they also have an issue with water. Right? And so without meaning to, again, we kind of did these trials and we thought, oh, no one's going to be interested in it here. And all of a sudden it was on the cover of this, newspaper and that newspaper because inadvertently we often share a lot of the same challenges, right? Even if they're at different scales or different types. So, what I would leave you with is this. We realize we have to do things differently. And we have to do those things together. We have open prizes, open challenges, and I mentioned development innovation ventures, where if you have an idea that's game-changing, and most importantly, if you have the evidence that it works, we have resources, we have incredible market depth, and we want to work with you. So I want to say a big thank you to all of the innovators who have been patient enough to navigate government and who are our partners, and most importantly, hoping that you all will join them. Thank you.
Please. I got to admit, I work in Washington. You're kind of freaking me out here because you're talking about a Washington that isn't the one that I recognize.
Hi, I'm from Washington.
Yeah, exactly, and
you're
here to help.
We're real.
There's a cultural challenge here, right? And
Absolutely.
Culture trumps strategy. What did you have to do with your peers and colleagues to get the infrastructure, the organization to understand that there were ways that were better, faster, cheaper?
Absolutely. I think even whether it's government or anywhere else, aspects of this is, change is uncomfortable. And wanting to kind of do things the way we do them, right? So when we started, there was a lot of, well, this is how we do it, not kind of. And so we said, well, is it illegal? They said, well, it's not illegal, but it's not how we do it. And so to your point, there was a lot of kind of taking that on. But I think the number one thing that really started to prove it was, number one, having amazing partners across the agency that did start these experiments and were willing to take on a little bit of that risk. But most importantly, it was about the results, right? When we were actually able to see, because a lot of these models that we fund almost from a venture capitalist view. So instead of, we say, here's some money. If it works, come back, we'll give you more. If it really works, come back and we'll give you more. And so in many ways, we were paying for results, which was turning the government model on its head.
Very much.
But people really can't refute results. And that's why, again, I push the idea of business intelligence, right? And making these kind of result-driven decisions. And in many ways, the results drive the flexibilities you really need to have.
Now, you mentioned VCs, so I got to tug at that thread for a minute, because VCs are famous, and rightfully so, for saying, here's a small amount of money. It's so small that if you fail, I really don't care. But in the government realm, failure is a very, very bad thing. How, again, were you able to convince the bosses to let you place some of those first small bets?
It's interesting. The whole purview of risk I find to be an interesting challenge. And I was really caught up in it at first and in the classic definition. And what I mean by that is that, we might do a program normally, in a normal programming, that's $100 million, right? $100 million over 3 years. And so, that's a lot of money. And so we were making the argument, well, hey, if we kind of start with $1 million of that, and we do a few rapid tests, and we end up getting something that then leverages that 99 million for so much more, it's worth it. But someone said something to me once that was game-changing for me on that, and it was this. They said, the interesting parity of risk that you're looking at now is the assumption that how you do it now is not risky. And this was my reaction, right? You're right. Because, again, here's $100 million. Hopefully that works, and then we have a good plan. And
if it goes wrong, it's just $100 million.
But think about it now. Who here has ever started with a business plan, et cetera, or your strategy, and in 3 years, it exactly executed like you thought it would? right? So the very nature of how we'd been doing business in many ways was flawed. I love to say that Christopher Columbus, didn't start out with a strategic framework, and so the idea of really, doing those little tests, being able to do them quickly, and being able to admit when it doesn't work and stop, right, is actually just smarter business. But it's taken us a while to kind of make that math make sense in government.
Now, here's a question I've been asking of just about everybody I've talked to. You spent time in the commercial world before coming into government service. What lessons were you able to bring with you that allowed you to successfully fight some of those conversations and get change through?
Oh my goodness. To be perfectly honest, I haven't seen anything work where what really made it work wasn't anything less than a passionate owner. Whether that was, private sector, whether that was government, time and time again, I've seen that ultimately it's about that passionate owner. It's about that person. It's about being that person who's willing to knock their head against the wall if they really believe it, who's willing to go, well, it's not illegal, so how do we take a step there, and things like that. And I think, amazing mentors, amazing lessons, but ultimately it's that really deep sense of courage, and that deep sense of passion that I may be wrong, but I believe in this, and I'm going to give it a go.
So one from the audience here, and I'm my suspicion, and that's all it is this is coming from somebody who's thinking entrepreneurially, but trying to figure out how to crack their way in. You talk a lot about actually talking to and listening to the customer, if you will, the person who's going to be receiving that aid. How can you maybe adapt that to talk to youth or community members more domestically? What are some of the tools and platforms you can use to really collect that information in a meaningful way, so it's intelligence, not just a random anecdote?
Yeah, this is something that we're really trying to champion being built into all of our programs. But there's actually a project that will launch very soon in the coming months. And for those who are participating in MCON, I'm happy to give you access, even though it's not public yet. And we were actually confronting this. It was this idea of democratized development. How do we actually allow innovators, entrepreneurs, to connect with funders, to connect with collaborators, right? Because one of the interesting things is that a lot of our innovators, for example, are great engineers, horrible business people, right? And so, we invest a lot in whether that's training them, but part of what they might need is just a really passionate MBA, right? Or someone who's just great at business, partnering with them. And so we're going to be launching something with partners around the world that in essence are about that. But more importantly, it's also a place where you can see all of the development innovation in one place. And this is one of the issues about that innovation supply and demand that is so painful, is that, great, there's innovation over here on this site, there's innovation on this donor site, on this site. But as a user, if I'm in Kenya and I'm looking for that water solution, there's nowhere I can go to see all of the water solutions.
It's knowledge management.
Exactly. And so we're doing that, but not only all the innovations, what people say about them, who's using them, right? That real business intelligence that allows me to make a decision that I feel confident with.
Another one from the audience. What steps do you need to take? What do you need to think about ahead of time to protect some of those ideas, to keep policy or that hierarchical imposition of, well, we do things this way, from coming in and potentially crushing a great idea?
You've got to know the space, right? So, at a personal level, whenever I'm navigating something that I know is going to be a little bit tricky, I look for alliances. But more importantly, I really try to infect an inspiration for it, right? I try to infect something where someone sees a sense of ownership or can get excited about it. Because interestingly, when someone is infected with that type of enthusiasm, they have the emotive capacity to and desire to overcome, a few things along with you. But I would say I do invest a lot, and we invest a lot in the agency and in the industry in really trying to bring someone along with a story. I had an interesting conversation with a bunch of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, and I asked them the question, looking back on your portfolio, what was the number one thing of all of the things that worked, that really returned an enormous investment? What was the number one thing that was common around those? And I expected them to say break even or exit or team. And they said a great story, a great and compelling story. Looking back, that was ultimately because people had to buy in. right? They had to get through. So I think that, to me, is the biggest issue.
So, and a related one, again from the audience, what would you say to a recent graduate interested in working for you or working in a similarly innovative environment? What's that doorway in? How can they get to be a part of this?
Yeah. So I think two things. Number one, we're hiring. So do look at us and USAID in general. But I think the other thing that's really interesting is that, we are by no means the only players in this space. Foreign direct investment, we used to be about 90%. We only make up about 7% now. And so you're going to see a lot of, whether it's private sector, social impact, in many ways, the developing world is 45% of our economic growth market. Right? And so companies and entities want to be there. And what's interesting is that we often find, especially in a millennial cohort, et cetera, a willingness to think differently. And I think there's a real openness to this idea of innovation. And there's also a reality that it's very hard sometimes to be innovative if you've been in this structure a long time. So we actively look for that. And I will tell you very specifically that we look at things like, how do we bring in artists, right? How do we bring in marketers? How do we get on engineers? We had an astronaut. And part of that is because those different disciplines of thinking are actually really valuable, right? Because you approach the project in things different ways. And I think that the larger industry is coming around to that. But to be perfectly honest, when I look to hire someone, all of their qualifications are a tick in the box. I look at them and I say, are you going to be enjoyable to work with? Are you going to be a pain in my butt? Are you going to make me happy, like to see you, and are you going to make me excited about my own project again, right? Are you going to be, fun and pleasant and push the envelope? So a lot of times I find it's much more attitudinal than it even is kind of the tick of the box of qualifications.
So we're running out of time. I've got to ask just one more. Normally I would sniff at such a frivolous question, but I asked it backstage and the audience, without me prompting it, voted it up to the top. Where did you get those awesome shoes?
eBay, $17. I have 9 other pairs, snow leopard, pink, fire engines, all of those. So
let's not let that detract, though, from the fabulous story and the awesome work you're doing. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Thank
Enjoyed
you.
it thoroughly.